Good morning, students. Today we are going to discuss the life and works of T.S. Eliot, who is known as Thomas Stearns Eliot, and he is a critic. We have in our paper Principle of Criticism, the Traditional and Individual Talent, essay by Eliot. So let us first discuss about the critic, then we will discuss the essay, Traditional and Individual Talent. So this is the picture of T.S. Eliot. He was born on September 26, 1888 at St. Louis, Missouri, US. Died on January 4, 1965, London, England. He is an American English poet, playwright, literary critic, and editor, and a leader of the modernist movement in poetry, and the founder of the well-known journal The Criterion. Eliot exercised a strong influence of Anglo-American culture from 1920s until late in the century. His experiments in diction, style, and versification revitalized English poetry, and in series of critical essays he shattered old orthodoxies and erected new ones. Young Eliot. The publication of his four quartet and the Wasteland led to his recognition as the greatest living English poet and man of letters, and in 1948 he was awarded both Order of Merit and Nobel Prize for Literature. T.S. Eliot receives 1948 Nobel Award. Poet gets Bright in literature, Brighton wins in physics, and Suyud in chemistry. Notable works: The Wasteland, Murder in Cathedral, The Dry Salvages, Burnt Norton, East Cocker, Four Quartets, Little Gidding, The Sacred Wood, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, Sweeney Agonist. So few works out of these you may be familiar with. The Wasteland, Fourth Quartet, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Let's go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Okay, so Eliot, let us discuss his early life. Eliot was descended from a distinguished New England family that had relocated to St. Louis, Missouri. His family allowed him the widest education available in his time, with no influence from his father to be practical and to go into business. From Smith Academy in St. Louis, he went to Milton in Massachusetts. From Milton, he entered Harvard in 1906. He received a BA in 1909, and after three insisted of the usual 4 years. So he completed his graduation in 3 years. The men who influenced him at Harvard were George Santayana, the philosopher and poet and critic, Irving Babbitt. Eliot, Santayana, and Babbitt. From Babbitt, he derived an anti-romantic attitude that, amplified by his later reading of British philosophers F. H. Bradley and T. E. Hume, lasted through his life. In the academic year 1909 and 1910, he was an assistant in philosophy at Harvard. He spent the year 1910 and 11 in France, attending Henri Bergson's lectures in philosophy at the Sorbonne and reading poetry with Hélène Fournier. Eliot's study of the poetry of Dante, of the English writers John Webster and John Donne, and of the French symbolist Julius Laforgue helped him to find his own style. From 1911 to 1914, he was back at Harvard reading Indian philosophy and studying Sanskrit. Those who have studied Wasteland can understand this. In 1930, he read Bradley's Appearance and Reality. By 1916, he had finished in Europe a dissertation entitled Knowledge and Experience in the Philosophy of F. H. Bradley. But World War I had intervened, and he never returned to Harvard to take final oral examination for the PhD degree. So he could not complete. In 1914, Eliot met and began a close association with American poet Ezra Pound. This is Ezra Pound, and he looks kind of insane kind of person, and he's famous for his insanity kind of. Eliot was to pursue four careers: editor, dramatist, literary critic, and philosophical poet. He was probably the most erudite poet of his time and in the English language. His undergraduate poems were literary and conventional. His first important publication and the first masterpiece of modernism in English was the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, 1915, which begins with the line, "Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table." Eliot was to pursue four careers. So, although Ezra Pound had printed privately a small book, a Lume Spanto, as early as 1908, Prufrock was the first poem by either of these literary revolutionists to go beyond experiment to achieve perfection. It represented a break with the immediate past as radical as that of Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth in Lyrical Ballads in 1798. From the appearance of Eliot's first volume, Prufrock and Other Observations in 1917, one may conventionally date the maturity of the 20th century poetic revolution. The significance of the revolution is still disputed, but the striking similarity to the Romantic is still uh, evolution of Coleridge and Wordsworth is obvious. Eliot and Pound, like their 18th century counterparts, set about reforming poetic diction, whereas Wordsworth thought he was going back to the real language of men. Eliot struggled to create new verse rhythms based on the rhymes of contemporary speech. He sought a poetic diction that might be spoken by an educated person, being neither pedantic nor vulgar. So, the poem J. Alfred Prufrock is famous for that: to have squeezed the universe into a ball, to roll it towards some overwhelming questions, to say, "I am Lazarus, come from the dead, gone back to hell, tell you all, I shall tell you all." And these are all listening and laughing over these intellectual statements. For a year, Eliot taught French and Latin at the Highgate School in 1917. He began his brief career as a bank clerk in Lloyd's Bank Limited. Meanwhile, he was also a prolific reviewer and essayist in both literary criticism and technical philosophy. In 1919, he published poems which contained the poem Gerontion, a meditative interior monologue in blank verse. Nothing like this poem had appeared in English till that time. With the publication in 1922 of his poem The Wasteland, Eliot won an international reputation. The Wasteland expresses with great power and disenchantment, disillusionment, and disgust of the period after World War I. In a series of vignettes loosely linked by the legend of the search for the Grail, it portrays a sterile world of panicky fears and barren lust, and of human beings waiting for some sign or promise of redemption. The poem's style is highly complex, erudite, and elusive, and the poet provided notes and references to explain the work's many quotations and allusions. This scholarly supplement distracted some readers and critics from perceiving the true originality of the poem, which lay rather in its rendering of the universal human predicament of man desiring salvation, and in its manipulation of language than in its range of literary references. In his earlier poems, Eliot had shown himself to be a master of the poetic phrase. The Wasteland showed him to be, in addition, a metrist of great virtuosity, capable of astonishing modulations ranging from the sublime to the conversational. The Wasteland. Now let us discuss our main aim for this year's syllabus, that is Eliot as a critic, because we are going to read the criticism of the poet. Eliot said that the poet critic, because he was a poet and a critic as well, a poet critic must write programmatic criticism, that is, criticism that expresses the poet's own interests as a poet, quite different from historical scholarship, which stops at placing the poet in his background. Consciously, intended or not, Eliot's criticism created an atmosphere in which his own poetry could be better understood and appreciated than if it had to appear in a literary milieu dominated by the standards of preceding age. In the essay Traditional and Individual Talent, appearing in his first critical volume, The Sacred Word, 1920, Eliot asserts that tradition, as used by the poet, is not a mere repetition of the work of the immediate past. Novelty is better than repetition, he said. Rather, it comprises the whole of European literature from Homer to the present. The poet writing in English may therefore make his own tradition by using materials from any past period in any language. This point of view is programmatic in the sense that it disposes the reader to accept the revolutionary novelty of Eliot's polyglot quotations and serious parodies of other poets' styles in The Wasteland. The next term related to Eliot and very famous was objective correlative. Also, in The Sacred Word, Hamlet and his problems sets forth Eliot's theory of the objective correlative. The only way of expressing emotions in the form of art is by finding an objective correlative. In other words, a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events, which shall be the formula for the particular emotion such that when the external facts which must dominate in sensory experience are given, the emotion is immediately evoked. Eliot used the phrase objective correlative in context of his own impersonal theory of poetry. It thus had an immense influence toward correcting the vagueness of late Victorian rhetoric by insisting on a correspondence of word and object. Two other essays, first published the year after The Sacred Word, almost complete the Eliot critical canon. The Metaphysical Poets and Andrew Marvell, published in Selected Essays, 1917 to 1932. In these essays, he effects a new historical perspective on the hierarchy of English poetry, putting at the top Donne and other metaphysical poets of the 17th century and lowering the poets of 18th and 19th centuries, the Romantic poets. Next term that is related to Eliot and again is very important is dissociation of sensibility. When he criticizes the poet of Romantic age, this term is very much relative. Let's see. Eliot's second famous phrase appears here, dissociation of sensibility, invented to explain the change that came over English poetry after Donne and Andrew Marvell. This change seems to him to consist in a loss of the union of thought and feeling. The phrase has been attacked, yet the historical fact that gave rise to it cannot be denied. And with the poetry of Eliot in pound, it had strong influence in reviving interest in the 17th century poet. The first or programmatic phase of Eliot's criticism ended with the use of poetry and use of criticism in 1933. His Charles Eliot Norton lectures at Harvard. Okay, this is the series of lectures. Shortly before this, his interest had broadened into theology and sociology. 3 short books or long essays were the result. They are Thoughts After Lambeth in 1931, The Idea of Christian Society in 1939, and Notes Toward a Definition of Culture 1948. These book essays, along with his Dante 1929, which is an inauditable masterpiece, broadened the base of literature into theology and philosophy. Now, literature has expanded its branch in theology and philosophy. He says, whether a work is poetry must be decided by literary standards, whether it is great poetry must be decided by the standards higher than the literary. Thank you. Thank you very much.